Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it a few minutes here for more folks to trickle in. Excited to have everyone here today for webinar number 6, partnership between the great folks at CTAA and CALSTART. Today we'll talk about fleet transition planning, and particularly how workforce development is a vital part of that component. So give it a few more minutes for folks to come in. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Like I mentioned, we're excited to be with you here today to talk about workforce development as it relates to fleet transition planning. Great session planned for you today. Myself, I'll be leading us through this journey today, and pleased to be joined by Mr. James Hall, principal and founder of ZEB Tech LLC. Jared Schneider, who's been on a number of these calls with us, unfortunately is stuck in travel limbo, so he will not be able to join. So he will get us on the next one. But excited to have you here today, and we're ready to get rolling. So just a brief agenda. We'll go over some introductions and recaps from the previous meeting. Again, we've got our session on workforce development with James Hall. We'll have plenty of time for questions, and then we'll wrap up at the end. First off, I'd like to pass it over to Scott. Scott, do you have any updates you'd like to share from the CTAA side?
Oh, thanks, Mike. Yeah, this is really an important piece in the transitions. You know, the focus and a lot of the energy in this series of webinars has been really about equipment and technology and transition plans, and those are all a big piece of it. But it's just critical not to forget the staff, the employment, the employees, the training component in all of this. So excited to be a part of this, and you know, in terms of other transit industry updates for the folks that are on here, a couple interesting things that have come out of FTA recently that I would point you to. One is there's some discussion also, and it kind of fits with what we're talking about today on workforce. FTA is responding to NTSB on an hours of service regulation, and they're just starting that process. But I would encourage you to link in on that. I had some interesting discussions and dialogue with the labor unions yesterday about this, and from what we can tell, it didn't really come from the transit industry in terms of operators, and it didn't come from labor. And so our thinking is that this has been raised by the National Transportation Safety Board as an issue. But hours of service, much like we see in the over-the-road trucking space, is suddenly an issue that is on a lot of people's minds here, and it'll be interesting to see that. So that piece, and as well, some of you that are on the call here, I know I briefed the APTA bus task force has been doing a lot of work, a lot of it around EV purchasing, and we continue to kind of monitor what's happening in the vehicle marketplace. It's one thing to have great plans, great transition plans, great training and staffing plans, but we do need good manufacturers to be partners in all of this, and to have good equipment that we can get quickly, or at least reasonably quickly. So there's been some good discussions. If anybody as part of this is interested in kind of what we've been hearing and adding into that mix. I saw Todd was here. I know he's been in some of the meetings. I'm happy to share that as well. But with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mike, and kind of for the recaps before we jump in here.
Great, thanks, Scott. Yeah, just briefly recap in webinar number 5. So we talked about 2 really vital, important topics: infrastructure planning and utility considerations. So, in the whole kind of gamut of developing your fleet transition plan, I think one of the things that you've heard us talk about in these is the need to engage with utilities early and often. If you're not familiar with the utilities, it's really important that you get familiar with them in short order, that you begin having those conversations. They really are a partner who wants to help, as we heard from Lynn Felsen from DTE last time. They really want to help. They want to make sure you can succeed with the projects, but they need the information. They need to know what you need, what you're planning to do, and what your timelines are. So it's really key that you begin those conversations with the utilities early and often. We'll say that as many times as we can to kind of drive that point home, because it really is critical. And then obviously the infrastructure planning. You may or may not need infrastructure upgrades. It's really important to think about what you potentially may need for vehicles, for charging infrastructure, for fueling, if you're looking at hydrogen. So really considering, as you're going through the fleet transition planning process, what your existing facilities can support, what you may need to be successful in implementing these ZE technologies, and then looking towards the future. As you expand out, are you going to need new facility improvements? Are you going to have to look for new funding for that? What's that timeline looking? So again, the 2 kind of key ingredients. We often focus on the vehicles, like Scott mentioned. Having the best vehicles in the world is great, but if we don't have the coordination with the utility and we don't have the facilities that can support them, it's really kind of a non-starter. So again, just kind of driving that point home that, engage with the utilities often, and then think about your infrastructure needs and what that kind of planning process looks like, because it really can help drive the conversation beyond just the vehicles. So great things there. So we're really excited to having this webinar. Like Scott mentioned, workforce development is vitally important as you're going through this process. And really, it touches all facets of the agency, from the executive leadership down to the maintenance teams who make sure the buses hit the road, and the operators who are actually driving them safely and doing the service. So it's really important that you engage with all these people, all these layers of your organization. It's really a great way to involve your organization in the process to be successful in your transition to ZE. So we're really excited to go through this, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. James Hall. James, if you could, if I can get my screen to work here, sorry. There we go. James, if you go ahead and give us a brief introductions, and we're excited to hear your presentation.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Mike, Scott. Good to be here. Thanks everyone as well for joining. I hope the conversation that we have today will be insightful. So to start, we're going to go ahead and just talk a little bit about preparing your frontline workforce for zero emission vehicles. So if you jump to the next slide, I will go ahead and just introduce myself. So like Mike said, my name is James Hall. I'm the principal and founder of ZEB Tech. And my career actually started in the automotive industry. So I started as a master automotive tech, and I was, wrenching along with just about everybody else. And I specialized specifically in electrical diagnostics. So most of my work was focused around hunting down those little gremlins that pop up with, you harness from time to time. I've got a misfire and I don't know why. And now I need to go through and figure out what's going on. And so I specialized in that type of work. Unfortunately for me, while I was very much enjoying working in the automotive field, the pay was not reliable. So I started focusing more on finding a position within transit. And since I live in the DC area, Washington Metro became extremely exciting to me to explore the opportunity to work with them. And eventually a position opened up where I could work on the rail cars. So I was working on the subway cars at Metro. And then from that point forward, I found myself again just kind of specializing on the diagnostics of the electrical systems. And then there was an opportunity for me to transition into the training team. So I spent about 7 years, 8 years roughly with the training team at WMATA, building a lot of curriculum, the courseware that they use nowadays for the 2K, 3K, the 6K, parts of the 7K. I was involved with all of it. And I eventually found that I wanted to do something a little bit bigger, a little bit more. And that was when the opportunity at Proterra presented itself. So I got into Proterra, it'd be about 5 years ago at this point, before everything had gone public with them. And I had the chance to essentially come in and start building their training program. So I brought in the entire team that was doing really just all of the training that they were providing to their customers. We designed their courseware curriculum. I hired people that could really bring in that 3D modeling, CAD modeling to the training program. So a lot of what some of you may have seen at this point is really just the plan that we had put together, that my team had put together while I was there. So it's exciting to see what they're capable of doing and producing. Following Proterra, it was with the ITLC, where I worked with them to issue and develop the ZEB training standards that have recently been published through APTA. We had a huge network of subject matter experts, OEM support, union representatives, everybody that has had a chance to get familiar with zero-emission technologies played a role here in guiding this, and we did a fantastic job over the course of about 18 months. So that is one of my proudest moments, because that really was something that the industry needed, and the fact that we were able to come together and make that happen was a big deal. So from that point with ITLC, I decided that I wanted to help even more people. So there's a theme here. I always want to kind of expand the audience that I have, and I'm trying to help more people, and this is where ZEBTech came into play. Next slide, please. So what is ZEBTech? ZEBTech is a workforce development consultancy that is offering support for zero-emission transitions for agencies of all sizes and transportation fleets that are just looking for a little bit of guidance and subject matter expertise. This is where we're here to help. So if there's anything here that we can lend a hand with, please feel free to reach out, and we can discuss exactly what services we can provide. Next slide. So to that point, everybody on is not specifically here to listen to me talk about ZEBTech or myself. Instead, we're here to talk about designing a ZEB training program. And I'm going to go through a few of the challenges that you're going to see as you decide exactly what this program will need to look like. One of those bits here specifically is with the LONO funding through the FTA. When you're authoring your zero-emission fleet transition plan, or you're working with a consultant to author your zero-emission fleet transition plan, this specific piece here needs to be counted on as part of the focus. So what you need to make sure that you are saying to the FTA is that you have accounted for workforce development. You have accounted for the need to make sure that you are not displacing workers. You're planning to upskill, you're creating a pipeline. You have thought all of this out. And to their credit, the FTA has also issued, I believe it's 8 total questions for you to consider and work through. They want you to answer those in as best of a way as possible. This is where I and a few of my colleagues in the industry have also gone through and put together just kind of ways to start thinking about those questions and how you can take those different exercises and thought and then apply it to your plan. So first off here, the biggest issue that you need to deal with is identifying the skills needed for the new technology. So the skills gaps as well. And the skills gap is going to be something that presents itself shortly after you analyze your workforce, right? So typically this is going to be something along the lines of your technicians, for example, may not have had to use their digital multimeter anytime recently, or if they do use it, they're usually only checking 12, 24 volts and nothing in the high voltage range. When was the last time that they had to use certain PPEs? So high voltage safety is a consideration here. There are other bits that we'll talk about shortly as well, but these are small considerations to start thinking about right away. So how exactly is my workforce going to be affected? Now, considering that my background is maintenance, I often rely on that as my anecdotal information. However, it's just as important to start to consider that your drivers are going to be affected. You're going to get better range out of these vehicles if you make sure that you communicate to your drivers ahead of time that they need to start operating more efficiently. So again, this is just all something to think about when you're looking at the skills that are going to be needed to safely and efficiently operate and maintain these vehicles. So once you've thought about the skills and you've got a general idea of where some of those gaps are, this is where you're going to develop a ZEB training plan. And then once you have that plan in place, you have an idea of where you want to take this. So it could be something as simple as, we know that we have a really good skill set and we just need to upskill to the new technologies and subsystems, make sure we're accounting for safety practices, things along those lines. But then you need to identify your funding resources. Now, this can come through the LONO funding, the 5% that you're going to get for LONO, but there are other opportunities out there as well. There's, as of earlier this morning when I looked, if you type in workforce development grant programs, there are 1,400 that are available. Now, not all of them are going to be directly applicable to transit, but there are some that you may be able to creatively pursue. So start taking a look at those opportunities. And I just want to say that specifically was on the federal level. There are different options when it comes to state that can expand significantly. And then sometimes if you have the opportunity to leverage good connections with your state and local leadership, so mayors, governors, your different representatives, if they have funds that they're looking to allocate towards workforce development, it may be worth engaging them early on. Next slide. So I mentioned before some of the common skills gaps. One of the biggest gaps tends to be around the electrical fundamentals. And so one of the vendors that I've worked with in the past, Immerse Technologies here, uses this as a fantastic resource to describe essentially electricity. What am I talking about when it comes to volts, amps, and ohms, and the different applications, and how it's going to be affected when I'm looking at different measurements within my vehicles, within my systems. So part of that is just kind of the general understanding. Now that I have electrical fundamentals dealt with, I need to understand how that changes when I start looking at the magnitudes. So specifically in this case, high voltage safety is a big thing. I'd mentioned it before. If I know that I'm relatively safe for anything less than 50 volts, and we consider anything above 50 volts to be high voltage when it comes to our applications in transit, then I need to understand what risks are going to potentially affect me as I start working on this vehicle. And that's where the high voltage safety and PPE come into play. Going through and understanding what those risks are, understanding an assessment behind it, which PPE I need, how often I need to replace that PPE, how do I inspect it, how do I know it's in good working order. These are bits and pieces that are skills gaps that, frankly, we have not had to worry about before, but now we're starting to focus in on those. I mentioned your digital multimeter proficiency. This is a big deal as well. Up until recently, you could have mostly used a test light and gotten away with it. When we're starting to talk about high voltage vehicles, whether it be battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell, the rule of thumb here is pretty much universal. You should not be using a test light on any of those. I don't care if it's if you're just using it on the 1224 system, you should not be using a test light anywhere near. It creates a safety hazard. So making sure that your technicians, that your workforce is able to use their digital multimeter efficiently and be able to interpret the data that they are presented with. That makes a big difference. So there are two last pieces here, and one of them is something that we really don't talk about too much, but I've sort of coined it as data analytics, and the phrasing on this is a little bit different depending on who you want to talk to, but from my point of view, this is probably the best way to describe it. So data analytics and critical thinking are ways that we need to be able to interpret graphs. When we're looking at these new vehicles, there's a lot of data and there's tons of signals that are out there, but I need to understand exactly what all of those signals mean, as well as what the fault data is telling me. And then on top of that, I also need to go through and validate my initial hunch that the failure of the root cause analysis that I'm performing right now is likely due to one reason, and I would validate that against my schematics, right? So I go back through and everything that I have done, this is the critical thinking piece of it, points to this one direction, this one component that failed, and maybe it caused multiple failures downstream, but we know that this is the root cause, and this fix will make sure that this vehicle is running correctly and back out on the road the way that it should be. And I mentioned before, we should never overlook the fact that efficient operation is going to make or break these systems. We have had conversations over and over again with different agencies, with OEMs that have reported this back, where there are customers out there, there are people out there who have started to adopt this technology, and your buses are advertised as getting 250 miles, right? That's at least what the hopeful range is. And, somebody comes back and says, well, I'm only getting 150 miles out of this vehicle. How is that, even possible? And honestly, it really just comes down to efficient operation the majority of the time. So Scott and I were talking about this earlier, and things that you maybe don't really think about. Can you park this vehicle in a shady spot on a hot day to save a little bit of extra energy? That makes a difference. Starting to think about how to create a behavioral change with the operators so that they're starting to think about how to maximize the state of charge on that vehicle. This is a skills gap that will need to be addressed. Next slide. So I mentioned the data analytics, and this piece that or this picture that I've included here is really one of the best ways to kind of drive that point home. Right now, we're just simply looking at what is a torque curve and a measurement over a period of time. Most of the technicians will know this as a snapshot, and they've seen data like this before, but they haven't seen the number of signals all in one place, and trying to understand exactly what this is telling them makes it a little bit of a challenge. So this is something that we need to start looking at early on and ways to upskill. Now, I will say that while data analytics is very much a topic that we need to focus in on, it doesn't have to be taught right away. We don't have to upskill to data analytics right away. This is more that mid-level priority where we first have the electrical fundamentals and high voltage safety and PPE being your main priority. That is where you need to start planning around your training before you even have looked at procuring any vehicles. We can jump to the next one. So when we're looking at analyzing the workforce skills, one thing that I always try and make sure everyone is aware of is that all of your workers will be affected. Everyone. That is from your CEO all the way down to your back office personnel and your facilities maintenance folks. Everybody is going to be affected in some capacity. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that your operators need to go through maintenance training. It's just you need to plan for the unlikely scenarios where there may be a thermal runaway event, there may be a hydrogen leak, and the people that may be affected by buildings nearby, or even if you're storing your vehicles inside and you have offices above that building, those people need to understand what all of those alarms mean, what the results could be, and so for that you need to start planning to upskill everyone in your workforce. The depth of the training, obviously, I said you don't have to go as deep for certain levels, but make sure you're doing the analysis behind that and that you understand exactly where those gaps are going to be for back office personnel versus your maintenance and operations staff. One of the best skills or one of the best tools you have in this case is going to be a skills gap analysis. To that point, this is something that is specifically called out by the FTA in the LONO funding. So in the guidance that they're issuing there, they want you to perform a skills gap analysis, or at least discuss how you plan to perform a skills gap analysis. Make sure that you engage your frontline workforce when doing this. So if you have labor unions at your agency, and this is something that you plan on rolling out to do a skills gap analysis, you should go to the labor union first. Make sure that you're talking to them saying, we need to identify where these skills gaps are. And if at all possible, have them roll out the skills gap analysis. It's simply a questionnaire. It's meant to be anonymous the majority of the time, but the whole goal here is to make sure that you are communicating to them that this is not punitive in any way. You're not punishing anybody for saying that they don't understand certain concepts. It gives you a guide on exactly where your gaps are and how you should start training almost immediately. So one of the other things that I will commonly emphasize here is just because you performed one skills gap analysis early on doesn't mean you have to stop there. You can perform these multiple times throughout your rollout. So as you're transitioning to zero emissions, if you're curious to see where the workforce is and you don't feel like you've gotten any direct feedback from anyone, or you don't have good data to show it, then another skills gap analysis to prove that you have made have moved forward is always a good idea. The next part here is developing a training plan. I had mentioned before, so make sure that you establish joint committees from the start. I mentioned, engaging your labor unions if you have them, but in general, frontline workforce, you should establish an equal number of representatives between your management and then your frontline workforce in this case to actively start to think about how they are going to roll this training out and what that program looks like. Even more so, this ends up being valuable for the direct feedback from the frontline workforce. As your frontline workforce is starting to encounter the new technology and engage it, and they're learning more about it, they can tell you where the gaps are, not in their skills, but sometimes in the process and the operations. If they see that the vehicles aren't working properly, or in some cases, there have been issues that I've talked to different operators about where their entire operations staff, all of the operators and drivers, they don't fit, right? They don't fit in the seats. They're the wrong style, wrong bus for them. It's not going to work. And that's something to consider about your next procurement cycle. So if you know that these buses just aren't going to work for your staff, that's okay, but you can plan around that now and understand what those challenges are going to be for the next round. Evaluate any available resources and new technologies. This is a big deal for a lot of the smaller agencies that I work with. More times than not, you don't have the capacity to spare someone for training and send them out for 2 weeks at a time. It's just not possible. So finding different ways and getting creative to roll training out it's imperative here. If you have access to e-learning, AR, VR, and different ways to make sure that any OJT could simply be a follow-up piece, this is something to think about when you're developing your training plan. And if you need to identify additional resources, again, there's a ton out there. It's just a matter of, finding exactly where those resources exist and then procuring them. Which, to that point, ideally the 5% low-no funding will help with part of that. I mentioned the delivery methods with e-learning versus instructor-led, so make sure you're thinking about that as well. And then the one big piece here too, to also make sure that you're acknowledging and identifying is your regional partners. That's either other agencies, and with the smaller network, honestly, with small agencies and medium-sized agencies, if you can partner together, you have much more likelihood of success in this case. And I'll get into that in just a minute here, but identifying other agencies, any tech schools, high schools, STEM schools, community colleges, universities even. There are places in Michigan that I've been to that, like University of Michigan, is looking to develop an entire workforce development program around EV. So looking at different opportunities to create those partnerships is huge. I also will always make sure that I promote apprenticeships here. If you have the possibility of designing and then implementing an apprenticeship program, you should absolutely explore it. And if you need help with that, I will always say that my colleagues over at the ITLC are absolutely fantastic at helping guide different agencies through developing their apprenticeship program. Next slide. So the last part here, as I mentioned before, is identifying the funding opportunities. This is where, typically speaking, you can get very creative. So first off, the 5% on top of all low-no awards is always a given. So if you're receiving low-no funds, you're basically getting 105%. That's the best way I tend to describe that. You don't have to factor in 5% into what you're getting. You're just getting money on top of what you had requested. Apprenticeship and mentorships, if they're registered through DOL, there's funding that you can receive for the apprenticeship program. So those are things to explore as well. I mentioned the collaborative partnerships for a very specific reason. So Ohio DOT is an example that I like to use right now, where they had it was a collaborative partnership between 10 different agencies of medium to small size, where they worked together with CALSTART to put together a proposal and then submit it to the FTA for low-no funding. They received, I believe it was just over $1 million in workforce development funds. And that's a huge deal because for 10 of them, that's a large amount of money to be able to work with. But what they're planning on doing is essentially establishing their own network to be able to roll out training amongst themselves. So the smaller agencies that maybe don't have the capacity or resources to do any training in-house will be able to receive the same level of training and support. This is a discussion that it's a very optimistic viewpoint, and I still like to put it out there and have the conversation early, is if there is a way for you to create some sort of reciprocity agreement amongst yourselves where You have engaged the labor unions. You've gotten an agreement with them. You've incentivized workers to maybe rotate if you need support from one agency to another. That would be a fantastic way to solve some of these problems, because we just don't have enough resources and enough workforce yet to really solve a lot of the training problems that we're talking about today. The other thing that I really want to make sure I drive home is make sure that you apply for every single opportunity that you come across. So I mentioned it before, 1,400 different grants were out there, like as of today. Those numbers continue to change every single day. There's always more that's going to be released. January, that's going to skyrocket again. There will be more grant opportunities that are available to you. I use this picture here, the West Coast Center of Excellence, for my example in this discussion, because Lauren Skyber is famous for saying this. She has always promoted that the only reason they were able to get the workforce, the West Coast Center of Excellence, up and running was because they started applying for grants that were out there. If you don't apply, you know the answer is no, right? And we say that about just anybody trying to hire into a position or that is interested in making a career change. The same applies for any of your workforce development endeavors. So please, make sure that you're going out, and if you see an opportunity to explore a new grant, you should target it. Next slide. So briefly, I'm going to go ahead and talk about just the maintenance training standards that are out there. So you have essentially built your entire fleet transition plan at this point, but the one thing that you're not sure of how to do is build the training. Let's say you also don't have the staff to do it in-house, and you're planning to roll this out to a contractor who is going to do your courseware development. This is where the training standards really come into play. This was a collaborative effort, again, between the ITLC, APTA, unions, OEMs, subject matter experts throughout the industry, to pull together all of the objectives that need to be met for any technician to be able to work on, safely work on any of these vehicles, any of the equipment. This includes battery electric bus and hydrogen fuel cells. So we have a complete program that has been built into these standards, from level 100, which is your introduction and familiarization. Level 200 is going to be theory and getting into more of the safety practices and principles. And then level 300 is going to be your diagnostics and your maintenance practices. Right. So all of those are built into this. It's a guidebook. Anybody that's a courseware developer, in-house or external, should be able to take this information. And as long as they have different reference material to be able to work with, they should be able to create an entire program for you. So I encourage everyone to go through, download this. The QR code here should take you directly to APTA's website, but I have also included the link just below so that you can access it as well. Feel free to peruse those standards. And if you have any questions, reach out, because this was this was a labor of love. It was a lot of work that we did. Next slide. I will close out there. I think I hit that 30-minute mark almost perfectly. So I really appreciate the time for everyone, or the time being here today. And Mike, Scott, thank you for having me. If anyone needs to get in contact, feel free to reach out. My email address is listed here. The website is also listed. And if you have any questions, you can also just give me a call. I'm happy to field any questions you may have and answer anything that pops up.
James, thanks so much. I definitely want to open up to questions. It looks like we may have a couple in the chat here. Maybe not.
I do have a couple. If no one else
please,
does.
Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, James, you were mentioning PPE, which was frankly a word we got all too familiar with during the pandemic. Give folks a sense of what that is. I've seen the gloves. I'm assuming that's a piece of it, but there's probably more than that too.
Yes. So gloves are your start. You're going to have high voltage rubber gloves with leather overlays to protect them. But typically with most of these vehicles, you're going to need some sort of arc flash gear. Most of what I'm seeing right now is usually 8 to 12 calories per centimeter squared. You're going to have a hard hat, some sort of face shield. There will be a balaclava that needs to be worn, safety glasses. Your earplugs also count here. And then the biggest part is you need to have high voltage, or you need to have safety boots that are rated for this. So there's a difference between the boots as well, and make sure that you are using the OEM's recommendations in this case. There are specific boots that are insulated versus ones that are grounding. You want the ones that are insulated, and that is it's different between those two.
Thank you. The other question I had for you was, given your kind of start in the ZEB world with Proterra and what they've been going through, I'd just be curious, what's your take on the breaking it up and purchasing, and whether or not they're going to be building buses anytime soon?
I honestly, I'm curious to see how this plays out myself.
Yeah.
I would love to see, considering how this is broken up, I would love to see Nova sort of do an about face, honestly, since Volvo is the one that bought the battery side. So since Volvo has the battery technologies, if Nova turns themselves around, I think that would be huge for the industry and make a big difference.
Agreed. I was wondering the same thing with Volvo's involvement in both now.
Yeah, exactly. As far as the transit side, I don't know enough about Phoenix Motors to really offer any sort of insight. I know that this all still needs to go through regulation, so the SEC needs to sign off on everything before these acquisitions are true. So we'll probably see that early next year. But yeah, it's unfortunate that we're in a limbo right now, because that's kind of the state of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, any loss of capacity in the manufacturing space right now, and we were just touching on Nova and Proterra, it's significant when you think about the increases in the low-no funds and the ability to turn those into new fleets and meet with our transition plans and meet with our asset management plans. It's certainly a more challenging environment than it's been in. That's not a question, just a comment.
Yeah. Well, from a technological standpoint, specifically with Phoenix Motors, one of their designs incorporates a drop and replace sort of battery technique, where you can drop out the entire battery pack and replace it with one that has been completely charged, which I can see from their designs already being on the cutaway side there, why they would take interest in Proterra, considering that Proterra's batteries are all mounted. The majority of them are mounted underneath the vehicle. So it'd be an easy drop and replace in that scenario. So I'm curious to see if Phoenix follows through with this. It would be a good opportunity, I think.
If I was a smaller system, maybe even the type of system that has all of its maintenance done offsite under contract, local experts. My question would be, how would you approach? I'm looking now at getting a couple of 40 transits and moving them into my fleet. What would be your recommendation if I've never kind of hosted a lot of internal maintenance on how to approach that part of a transition?
That's always a challenging one. So if you haven't done the maintenance yourself, the first piece of this, especially if you are requiring, let's say you have a contractor that's handling the majority of the maintenance, this would be an opportunity for you to basically set standards on the training of what comes down to their employees. It's always a challenge because it depends on the contract, right? I've seen a few scenarios where you as an agency, in this case, maybe it's only 20 people or so that make up the actual agency, and then you contract out to that contractors, like TransDev, for example. In some of those cases, if you have the opportunity to define what requirements need to be met for any of those technicians to work on the vehicles, it sort of forces the hand of the contractor to then make sure that they're upskilling the workforce. I know that doesn't work for everyone, because there are some cases where you have very little control over that negotiation.
Right. So
maybe like redefining a job category could also be an opportunity here to make sure that the people that are working on these vehicles now also have the training and upskilling that they need.
And to be clear, and I think there is a question that's come in, Mike, but to be clear, what we're saying here is you've got to put this level of rigorous thinking into a switching out of BOCs or minivans into 4D transits, just like you would if you're switching from in the 40-foot bus sector. That all of this process we're talking about here is equally applicable to both of those types of transitions.
Absolutely. It's also fair to acknowledge that we're going to trip up on occasion as we make this transition. It's okay. One of the things that we often sort of forget about from a training and workforce development piece is that one of the best ways to learn is to do it wrong. So if you can minimize how wrong you do it in the first place, that helps quite a bit. And that's where people like us are able to reach out and support. We have the experience, the expertise to be able to offer some sort of guidance.
Yeah, you don't want to be wrong around high voltage.
That's exactly the point, right? So we're minimizing exactly how bad the wrong is in this case. But let's say that I mentioned this before. If you procure vehicles that do not fit your operators, it's just not designed well for the people that are driving your buses. That's we messed up. Okay, well, we learned from this one. We didn't take that into account before, but we know that this design of bus does work for our fleet, and we can transition to that, and it meets our needs just as well. So those are ways that it's not as big of a mess up, but it's something that can be dealt with in future procurements. I would also say that you had mentioned getting creative in how you think about this. If you can do part of your transition as a pilot, so piecemeal as you're moving along, you said a couple of 40-foot buses, you want to bring that in internally. Great idea. Instead of you trying to transition your entire fleet all at once and diving in head first, it helps you along the way to be able to address some of those issues, especially if you're dealing with range problems very early on, if you are able to do a pilot program first.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We did have one question come in, 5% low-no funding, the use for training, does this have a local match? So that typically under FTA regs, and there's a good FAQ on this on the low-no page, it's an 80-20% split. So there is a local match for that workforce development. One good thing about it, though, we were talking about this earlier before we started, is that there's not a whole, well, I guess it depends on your opinion. There's not a whole lot of guidance in terms of what you need to do for the workforce development in terms of what you're going to use the funding for. You don't have to specifically say, I'm going to do this. You can be fairly broad with it. So it does give you some leeway, some options really to try out different things, to look at different options that you want to do. Like James mentioned, you may try something and it doesn't work out and you need to shift gears. So keep that in mind when you're looking for that funding. You're not necessarily tied to, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. It gives you the flexibility to try out things that you want to do or you think may work for you, but also you keep that in mind that you can course correct if you need to, if what you're working on or what you're trying to accomplish isn't working for you. You're not tied to doing one set thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Todd, you asked that question. I think it's and James hit on it, and Mike and I were talking earlier. It's really important that when you put together your low-no proposal, you fully propose for the vehicles you need, and then add 5% for the workforce.
Right. Not
fully propose and then take 5% off of that number and do the workforce. Make the workforce work for you, not against you in this piece.
Yep, absolutely. It is a plus up, not a take down. So
yeah.
James, I did want to ask. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
One thing that you mentioned, Mike, I just want to point this out. Especially when we're talking about some of the smaller transit agencies, if you have the capacity to make adjustments, and I kind of mentioned about doing a pilot like this. Once you've released your fleet transition plan and you have it ready to go, if you find that it's not working and you need to revise it, that is perfectly fine. You're more than allowed to be able to do that. In fact, you're encouraged if you want to try a different technology because let's say you tried with battery electric and it's just not working, and hydrogen fuel cell is going to alleviate some of those stressors. Go ahead and make that adjustment as you're going along. So I just wanted to make sure that the audience was aware of that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we've said that before in this series that they're living documents, and you need to change them to fit your needs. So that's a great point, James. One thing I did want to ask from your perspective is we've seen an increase in interest in kind of augmented reality and virtual reality. I'm curious, how do you see that in the mix moving forward in the future? Do you see that as something that's a viable option for agencies who may not be able to send folks to direct schools or things of that nature?
I think it's a great resource. It's a tool that will be rolled out very, very, very quickly. And I think the biggest challenge is going to be adopting it. It's not unknown that there are still technicians that we work with that have struggles with like computers, right? Just generally understanding what they're supposed to be doing with a computer, simple troubleshooting things that might be simple to you and me, but they're completely foreign to somebody who has not had to do anything with that before. So there is going to be training around how to just simply use something like a HoloLens. But when you're looking at the training that can roll out with that, it opens up a world to something completely different. AC Transit and LA Metro both specifically have released a couple of videos of different programs that they have rolled out using augmented reality. And one of the videos that I really enjoyed the most is there's a compressor on a hydrogen fuel cell bus that they were working on that's impossible to see in any other capacity. And unless you have a separate training aid that is a mock-up that pulls everything out to be able to show you where that compressor is, it's not possible at all. With the augmented reality system and the training that they've designed that for, they can walk you through step by step. You can see exactly where that compressor is that you're trying to get to. And then not only that, you can see what the step-by-step procedures are while somebody else is on the other end guiding you through. So not only have you now created a training program that is extremely immersive and supportive, but you've also created a troubleshooting tool where maybe somebody that is at a remote location now has access to what you're able to see, and they can help guide you in troubleshooting that vehicle.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's fantastic. Yeah, the reason I asked that I got a chance to see a couple systems, and and I see a lot of promise with it, but obviously it's still fairly new. So just curious from your professional experience, what direction you see. Because again, I think for transit agencies, we're always looking, how can we leverage the experience of others? How can we leverage tools that are already existing, and how can we share knowledge? And so looking at these systems, it seems like there's a lot of promise moving forward with them.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of shared knowledge, there's a small program. I say it's small, it's actually quite large. They're funded really well, based out of I think it's the University of California system. But it's a website called Skills Commons. And for any of the agencies that are on the call here, if you are small and do not have the resources to develop any of your own training materials, Skills Commons offers essentially an open repository. So it is workforce development skills, and they're continuing to expand their library. They have quite a bit that's on there. I've worked with some of the people that are managing it right now, and it's impressive what they're pulling together. Now, I will say that there's a bit of an asterisk on this because there isn't a ton that is specifically geared towards transit yet, but it is something that is that they're trying to build out. So as I mentioned, I've worked with them before. I'm actively trying to guide them to pull more transit training materials into their network and make it available to everyone.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that's not to get off on a tangent, but I think that's one of the great things about transit is just the ability to share knowledge and the willingness to do so. I think that's something we've talked about before in this series, is that if you're thinking of doing something, someone has probably done it or thought of doing it. So, reach out to your colleagues and to your fellow agencies and to groups like CTAA, because there's so much knowledge and so much shared resources out there that can really kind of lower the barriers for agencies to be successful. So appreciate that. Any other questions or closing, Scott? Been great information, James. Really appreciate your time here today.
Yeah, just to those in attendance, this is a really good grounding in what you need to be thinking about, and I think James did a great job of not being so specific that he scared you off, but more giving you the right questions to ask so that you can develop a plan here, a training plan, just like you're doing a fleet as a component of a broader fleet transition plan that's scaled and sized to what you're doing. It's if it can't do that, then you need to find another way to get at it, because this is hard enough as it is without having things that can work specifically to what you need. So I just thanks, James. That was great information.
Thank you. Yeah, I was happy to be here, and I always welcome the opportunity to have these conversations. We need to have more of them, and I just in case it's not obvious, I get very excited talking about this.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. Really appreciate it. So that's the time for us today. Next webinar is December 19th. That'll be number 7, the final in our series, and we will focus on a transit agency who has actually implemented everything that we're talking about through this series, so we can hear what they did, how they did it, and how it's working for them. So appreciates everyone's times here today. Please reach out to James if you have any questions. An enormous wealth of knowledge on the workforce development side, and we thank everyone for their time here today.
Take care, everybody.
Everyone.